is already. It is the region that will actually see the sharpest contractions in standard of living. While the coastal regions, north, center, and south, can participate in export markets by dint of geography, the interior cannot. As such, the interior is completely reliant upon the perilous Chinese financial system for its income and economic activity. Interior regions dependent upon fertilizers produced elsewhere will be unable to maintain food production levels, leading to starvation in the cities. Interior regions that have partially modernized will suddenly find they need to operate without electricity, spawning mass population movements. Some of the displaced will return to the farm and so may alleviate somewhat the food production shortages. But food does not grow overnight. Even in the best case scenario, it would be months before food shortages could be meaningfully addressed. The remainder of the uprooted will move to the coast in a great exodus that Mao Zedong would find familiar. Opportunity for political demagogues not under Politburo control will abound. As for southern and central China, that is, southern and central coastal China, they will face management adjustments. Between the collapse of the Beijing-inspired financial system that has kept the southern and central Chinese happy, and the collapse of the international trade order that has made them rich, every coastal region south of the North China Plain will rebel against Beijing's control. Most will cut deals with foreign governments and corporations that can promise a degree of access to capital and markets and resources. In essence, everything from Hainan Island to Shanghai will become a series of unaffiliated city-states that hitch their wagons to American, Japanese, Taiwanese, Korean, Australian, and even Singaporean stars. Some of the outsiders might use military means to secure what they are after. Some of the coastal cities may not simply tolerate but actually suggest such moves in order to assist in their efforts to carve out a bit of wealth and security for themselves, and to keep a seething Beijing at bay. For its part, Beijing will fail in its struggle to stay ahead of such a hydra of problems. In no particular order, Beijing will have to try to keep northern China's food production under lockdown to make sure the North China Plain itself remains united, to maintain control of the seceding south and center, to resist the swarms of the desperate from the interior cities who have become accustomed to a lifestyle that China can no longer provide, and to stave off the Japanese who see the energy and food resources of northeastern China as a handy package. Even under good circumstances and between food and energy shortages, these will not be good circumstances. China would likely prove unable to handle more than one at a time, and all will hit at once. It will come down to the unenviable task of prioritizing. Does Beijing go to war with the Japanese to keep control of its northern food and oil producing region? Does Beijing go to war with the belt of coastal cities from Shanghai to Hong Kong to keep China in one piece? Does Beijing attempt to intercept the foreign powers that try to fuse those cities to distant destinies? Does Beijing use a military strategy to deal with the tens of millions of would-be refugees from the interior who seek the resources that Beijing must carefully husband? Cold logic would say that China has too many people and that a correction of a few hundred million might actually help. Unfortunately for such a value-absent analysis, the surplus population lives on the farms, and so will not starve without explicitly, deliberate, intentionally horrific, and cruelly and sustained action from Beijing. Regardless of their decisions, the northern Chinese face a dark, hungry, and harsh future, and even that assumes that Beijing can hold the Chinese core together and avoid the social, economic, and political breakdowns that have plagued Chinese history for the past 3.5 millennia. No matter how artificial, coincidental, or ill-planned Chinese recent rise has been, it still happened, and no multi-trillion-dollar trading nation can exist in a vacuum. China's explosive rise has impacted nearly every corner of the world, but 4 outcomes are worthy of particular mention, because when China falls, 3 will furiously unwind, and the 4th will become the largest concentration of wealth in the world. First, China vacuumed up much of the global market share for mid and especially low-skilled industries such as textiles and toys and garlic and steel and concrete. Chinese success has meant failure for countries ranging from Mexico to Morocco to India that had previous success in such industries. As China unwinds, much of this productive capacity will fall into disuse for any mix of financial, security, or trade access reasons. However, the previous homes of such industry have long since fallen into disuse and disrepair, if the infrastructure still exists in those places at all. There will be what can be described as a hiccup, although in some places a stroke might be a better analogy, as production and consumption patterns adjust to the sudden loss of supply. Finished goods prices will have to rise. Who will be able to take China's place at that stage of the production cycle will depend upon the traditional factors: access to capital, markets, resources, and trade lanes. The biggest winners will likely be Mexico and the countries of Southeast Asia, although much of the more highly skilled industry and agricultural production is likely to relocate back to the United States itself. Second, China's growth, and in particular its financial system that broke the link between expenditure and efficiency, resulted in unprecedented demand for every industrial commodity under the sun. Bereft of ravenous Chinese hunger, demand for industrial inputs, whether they be oil or copper or zinc, will plunge. Producers dependent upon the mix of Chinese-driven high prices and American-guaranteed shipping security will be those most impacted, with most output from places such as Brazil and Africa being put in extreme danger. The producers who survive will be those with lower production costs and better relations with and access to the United States, Canada, Australia, and again, Mexico and Southeast Asia. Third, China's rise also led to an improvement in diet for most of its 1.35 billion citizens. As with industrial commodities, much of China's food is sourced abroad. However, there will not be a wholesale collapse in international demand in basic foodstuffs. Most of China's food imports serviced China's coastal populations, which will still be able to somewhat access international supplies. This foreign access will be doubly important when one considers that China's financial system boosted local agricultural output right along with manufacturing. The demise of the financial system will hurt Chinese food production and may well necessitate greater food imports rather than the opposite. After all, the final service that any government cuts before it dies is food access. If China's failing governments cannot guarantee that, they are no longer governments. Finally, throughout this entire process, from today until well beyond the day that a unified China is no more, US dollar-denominated assets, and especially US government bonds, will become ever more popular. Many have opined how everything from America's seemingly chronic budget deficits to political deadlock to a weakening international profile demand that the days of the US dollar are numbered. Even if you don't believe in the long-term strength of the American economy, the unassailable nature of the American geography, and the centrality of American decision-making to how the world functions, even if you can find fault with absolutely everything presenting in this book, the fact remains that there just isn't any competition to the US dollar. Once the Europeans decided to partially fund their bailouts with insured bank accounts in 2013, the euro's candidacy for status as a global currency, much less the global currency, ended. Japan's financial system is closed to the world just as China's is. Opening it would trigger heretofore unheard of levels of capital flight. The remaining hard currencies of the world, the British pound, Swedish krona, and the Canadian, Australian, and Kiwi dollars, combined are but half the circulating volume of the US dollar. Gold isn't an option either. The total value of all gold mined throughout history is about $9 trillion, shy by half of what the world would need. Half of that $9 trillion is simply unavailable for use as a currency backer, existing as it does in things like class rings, cellular phones, and Egyptian museum exhibits. 2/3 of the remainder is held by the world's various central banks, and is unlikely to be pooled into currency that none of them would control. Various investors control the remainder, and they certainly won't be willing to part with their holdings for anything but an exorbitant price. Doubly so if those holdings are about to form the core of a new global currency regime. New gold flowing into the system is under 4 billion USD equivalent monthly. On average, China expands its money supply by 40 times that rate, while global goods trade alone is worth some $18 trillion annually. But don't believe me, believe the Chinese. Specifically, believe Liu Ping, a director general at the China Banking Regulatory Commission, the agency responsible for keeping China's banking sector functional. In 2009, he noted, "Except for U.S. treasuries, what can you hold? Gold? You don't hold Japanese government bonds or UK bonds. U.S. treasuries are the safe haven. For everyone, including China, it is the only option. We hate you guys. Once you start issuing $1 trillion to $2 trillion in new debt, we know that the dollar is going to depreciate. So we hate you guys, but there is nothing much we can do." If the Chinese realize that they have no options but to pour their earnings and savings into U.S. assets when their financial system is still humming along, when their demographics are still favorable, and when the global trade order still holds, just imagine the volumes that will flood toward the United States once China fails.